I'm joined here today by my colleagues Maria Irene Rizzo, Associate Expert, Shariful Islam, and Jianwei Yang, who are hosting the webinar along with me. I'd like to turn to housekeeping notes very briefly. If you wish to take the floor, you can click the raise hand icon that appears next to your name on the participants panel, and then we would be able to allow you to unmute from the moderator side, and then you would unmute yourself and speak. And please, when your speaking time is over, please mute yourself again and click the lower hand icon. You can also put questions in the chat box and send those questions to everyone. And if you need any technical assistance, please put your message in the chat box and we will take care of that. Kindly note that the session is being recorded and it's also broadcast live on YouTube. So by continuing to participate, you give your consent to that recording. And please help us to keep improving the experience of this and our other webinars and Minamata online sessions by filling out the survey at the end of this webinar. So with that, let me introduce our topic for today. The specific international program forms part of the financial mechanism of the Minamata Convention on Mercury, as set forth in Article 13 of the Convention. And it's set up to assist developing country parties and parties with economies in transition to implement projects that aim at strengthening their capacity to fully implement their obligations under the convention. Now, the terms of reference of the program were established at the first conference of the parties, and they were finalized at COP2. And the rules of procedure for our governing board were established at the third meeting of the board. So we're now opening the fourth round of applications. In the first round of applications to the SIP back in 2018, the board approved 5 projects for a total funding of approximately $1 million. In the second round in 2019, the board approved 10 projects for funding of approximately $2 million in total. And then in the third round, that was over 2020 and 2021, the board approved 9 projects for a total funding of approximately $2.2 million. So this fourth round launched on the 24th of April of this year, and it's made possible with the generous donor contributions to the specific trust fund. Those are from Austria, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And we're hosting this webinar today to support eligible parties in developing their project proposals. And we look forward to hearing your questions and discussing the important considerations that you'll want to think through when developing and submitting your project applications. And we'll hold a Q&A segment at the end of the presentation, and at which time you'll be able to ask questions verbally or in the chat function to the right side of your screen again. But also feel free to write your questions at any time during this presentation in the chat box. Again, this presentation will be recorded, and the recording and the presentation slides will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel within about 48 hours after this. So to cover what we're going to talk to you about today in this session, we will present the timeline of the application process. We will provide suggestions on how to identify and prioritize national issues of concern. We'll explain how projects can be elaborated using the application guidelines that are available to you. We'll provide some tips for finalizing your application, and then we will open the floor for questions and discussion. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Irene, our associate expert, for the next part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marian, and good day to all the participants. So let's move to the timeline for the fourth round of applications. And this slide is to give you the overview of this timeline, and we will show you the various steps in more details in the next few slides. So Sharifu, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so the fourth round of applications to the SIP opened on 24th of April 2024. It was a Wednesday, and the deadline for submission of applications is on Wednesday, 31st of July 2024. And please note that the applications submitted after this deadline of 31st of July will not be considered. After submission in August and September, the Secretariat will screen and review all the applications submitted. And the initial feedback that will be provided by the Secretariat is meant for you to receive some comments and technical suggestions for technical revisions that will help you clarify and correct some items in your application proposals. And this is to ensure that your application is technically sound and is ready for full appraisal. The revision could include that the Secretariat will suggest could include, for example, edits to the logical framework or to the project budget, but we will look into those in more details later on in this presentation. So you will receive these comments and suggestions from the Secretariat for technical revisions by Monday, 30th of September 2024. And after that, you will have a very tight window of only 1 month until 31st of October 2024 to provide updates before your project is fully appraised. So to resubmit your project application, taking into account the comments proposed and suggested by the Secretariat. So basically this step, as I said, is to ensure that your applications, when they go to the governing board of the SIP for appraisal and decision, are as good as possible. And if the proposal is approved by the board for funding by the SIP, it would require very little or no revisions after the approval. And the fact that we have this phase of screening and technical review before the project is resubmitted doesn't mean that your initial submission should be a rough draft, let's say, because the Secretariat will not be able to rewrite the project applications for you, and the amount of time that you will have for revisions, as I said, will be very limited. It will be only be 1 month after we send you the comments. So we really encourage you to follow the application guidelines that we will show you later in this presentation to submit your first draft by the 31st of July. In the next slide, this is the second part of the timeline of the fourth round of applications. So once we receive the proposals submitted for the second time on 31st of October 2024, we will prepare project appraisals for the SIP governing board, who will meet in January 2025 to consider the applications and approve the projects for funding. And the last step that you see here is about the notification. This means that the Secretariat will notify the outcomes of the governing board meeting to all the applicants who submitted project applications. And for the successful applicants, this is when the intensive work of implementation starts, because this is the time when they will have to address any other comments that will be required by the governing board. And the project documents will have to be completed and resubmitted, and then we will start the work on negotiation and signature of the legal agreement. And also at that point, you will have to communicate the contact details of a project focal point and of a project correspondent focal point and the banking details for your project. But all of this is outside the scope of this webinar, so we will now move on with the application process. And I will hand the floor back to Marian for the next part of the presentation. Thank you.
Great. So now that you have a snapshot of the timeline, We're going to move on to identifying and prioritizing your national issues of concern. But first, as first part of that, let's discuss the fundamentals of the specific international program, starting with how much funding is available. So the SIP projects may provide support from 50,000 US dollars to 250,000 US dollars per project. This amount is inclusive of the budget needed for monitoring, evaluation, and final financial reporting and audit. And we'll talk about those elements later in the presentation. Next, who can apply? Only eligible governments can apply to the specific international program. And to be eligible, a government must be a party to the convention and must be from a developing country or a country with economy in transition. Now, some of you may be in the process of becoming a party. And so if that's the case for your application to be accepted, you must have transmitted ratification documents to the UN Treaty Office by the time the application period ends. So that's 31st of July of this year. And the SIP takes full account of the specific needs and special circumstances of parties that are small island developing states and least developed countries. And now when we talk about governments here, we're referring to national government ministry or department, the one that is in charge of implementing the obligations of that country under the Minamata Convention. So affiliations of governments and local governments are not eligible. And please note that the application form differentiates between the applicant government, which refers to the government submitting the application, and the applicant government official, who is the lead contact person on behalf of the applicant government. Now, I do want to mention that certainly it can be other ministries other than the ministry that, for example, houses the national focal point to the convention, but the national focal point would sign off on the application form and be part of the process. So we'll talk about that more in just a couple of minutes. Finally, on this point about who can apply, the SIP doesn't only fund individual country projects. There can be regional, sub-regional, or interregional projects that several governments can jointly submit. But in this case, one government is specified as the project lead. And this could be a good approach for implementation issues, which are best addressed in a sub-regional or interregional coordinated manner. We have some examples of those. But in this case, the amount of funding available remains the same. Now, what is the duration of the project? All the SIP projects must be completed within 36 months. That's 3 years. We highly recommend that all technical activities be completed about 3 months before the end of the project period, so that the final reporting and auditing can all be completed within the time frame of the project. And finally, on this slide, criteria for project appraisal. The projects are appraised based on a set of criteria elaborated by the SIP governing board. First, there are eligibility criteria. So in addition to the government being a developing country party or a party with economy in transition, the project also must not duplicate efforts already funded by the Global Environment Facility or the special program. Now, in addition to eligibility criteria, we also have criteria for coherence appraisal and prioritization appraisal. So we'll touch on some of these topics during the presentation, and details of the criteria are also fully elaborated in the application guidelines. So you can look at each and every one of the appraisal criteria that the governing board will use to appraise and select projects. Now, in the next slide, since you've joined us for this webinar, of course, you are probably already very familiar with the convention and all of its articles and provisions. So we won't discuss those today, but we want to illustrate here that your application must reflect the ways in which you will improve your ability to implement one or more of the legally binding obligations of the convention. So on the slide here, you see a kind of snapshot of the convention architecture with the various types of control measures and then the enabling measures that sort of allow the implementation to take place effectively and completely. So these, looking at and thinking about these obligations in your context will be your starting point for designing your project proposal. And you'll first want to think about the particular change you seek to make and the problem that you seek to address through your proposals. So for example, you may have the results of your Minamata initial assessment or your national report to the convention. Maybe those indicate particular needs that still need to be addressed. So these, together with any other similar efforts or previous projects, provide you with a good idea about the national issues which require attention and project intervention, for which the SIP can be instrumental in getting you to that endpoint that you're looking for. So it's important to keep in mind the scope of the SIP while developing your project proposal. Now, our financial mechanism. Here in the next slide, you can see a snapshot of our financial mechanism. And if we can move to slide 10, as we noted in the introduction, the financial mechanism is established in Article 13 of the Convention, and it includes two parts. It includes the Global Environment Facility and the specific international program. But we also do consider the special program on institutional strengthening in the chemicals and waste arena as a really important mechanism that also supports parties and also those seeking to become parties to the Minamata Convention. So we look at all those together and we can see and we can help guide you as to which of the funds would best suit your needs. Now, I don't know if it's moving forward on other screens, but I'm still on a previous slide. Yep, can we go one more ahead now already? So we have developed this sort of picture of the different funds that support the Minamata Convention to give you a better idea of which fund might be the most appropriate for your current needs. So the SIP, of course, is focused completely on implementation of Minamata Convention binding obligations, while the special program would support institutional strengthening across more than one instrument in the chemicals and waste arena. So that would include the Global Framework on Chemicals, which of course is setting up its new fund at this time. And then the Global Environment Facility can provide somewhat of a different focus, which could be more, for example, more like an investment project or a project that really draws investment and technological change into a particular sector, for example. So the SIP project could lay the groundwork for a larger GEF project, or it could address different aspects of a larger issue. For example, we've had a project that built the capacity of rural health workers to address ASGM at the same time that that party was implementing both its ASGM National Action Plan as well as a Planet Gold project. So all these things were working in concert, and all the projects were reviewed very carefully to ensure that they were complementary and not duplicative. So your project would be screened very closely against that. But we're also happy to provide advice on which is the best fund for your current need. Now, I do want to note that the special program has also launched its current round of applications. It launched the same day as our SIP launch happened on the 24th of April. And those applications can be submitted up until the 23rd of August. So they have a slightly later time frame than we do. Our applications, again, must be submitted by the 31st of July. Now, let me move rather quickly to the next slide on developing a problem statement for your project and using a theory of change. So we recommend, but don't require, the use of a theory of change for you to conceptualize and start undertaking the planning of your project and developing the project to address a national issue of concern. So again, it's not required, but we find that it's a really useful way to bring your team and your cross-ministry group and your multi-stakeholder group together to begin designing the project in concert. So this is a very, very simple example of a theory of change. It's just a hypothetical example on your screen here. Many theories of change are much more complex, looking at assumptions and drivers, other related factors. But for our purposes, and perhaps for yours as well in the SIP, the simple format can also be quite useful. So it starts with an impact statement, and that's defined as the long-term change to the environment and to living conditions that you seek to effect. And the impact would not be achieved in full during the project's implementation period. And in this case, the impact statement is to protect human health and the environment from anthropogenic emissions and releases of mercury and mercury compounds, which is very reflective of the convention's obligation. Not obligation, objective, sorry. So once you've established the impact statement, you have to focus on developing a project outcome. That's the observed changes of behavior, knowledge, or skill, or it can be a change in condition. So examples of outcomes include improved knowledge and technical capacity, improved coordination and communication between stakeholders, increased awareness. So in this example on the screen, we've stated the outcome as increased national capacity for developing control strategies for existing and new sources of emissions. So as you can see, the outcome of this project is closely related to fulfilling one of the obligations of the convention, and it establishes that very clear link between the two. Now, after establishing the outcome, you need to think about the outputs. Outputs are tangible goods or services that the project produces or delivers. And in this example, we have the inventory of relevant sources in Annex D as an output. A national plan developed for emissions control is another possible output. So as you can see, these contribute directly to reaching the outcome of the project. Now, the last component of the theory of change in our example are the activities. And these are basic building blocks of the project. So you really want to think about the detailed activities which are required in order to achieve the output. So a very useful resource for you to draw on when developing your project is the UNEP Global Mercury Partnership. So that's a multi-stakeholder partnership. It currently has about 200 partners from governments, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, industry and academia. They have a broad range of expertise on mercury. They have a great deal of useful information resources and tools on their website. And so you can see the link there on your screen in this slide. So we do include the Partnership Secretariat in our technical review of project applications. And we do offer their advice to our applicants as well. But we do very much encourage you to proactively reach out to the UNEP Global Mercury Partnership or any of its partners for advice. Now, moving on, your projects must address gender aspects, That's a requirement under the SIP. Projects applications need to explain how the design, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of the project includes a gender lens. And the projects we know will be much more successful and their results will be more sustainable if they explicitly address gender. So not only should they consider how Mercury risks and management approaches might impact men and women differently, but they should also integrate the principles of equal participation and non-discrimination, including in the staffing and management of projects, also in stakeholder engagement and in public participation. The projects should ensure that they raise awareness among both men and women and ensure opportunities to include the perspectives of both men and women, such as in training opportunities. And the project should be able to demonstrate that it's doing this and has done this when it is reviewed. So it will be useful in that regard to include gender indicators and targets in the log frame. It's not required, but it's really useful, and it really keeps the project team on track to keep this gender lens in focus. So yeah, an example of an indicator could be on the impacts and exposures to mercury differentiated by sex. And you would also want to be able to report on that in your reporting. So I won't go through all the ways that you can include gender aspects in your application. There's some useful information in the application guidelines. And we also recently, back in March, did a Minamata online session on that topic. So I encourage you to refer to both those sources of information. And I do want to note also that stakeholder engagement is really critical in this regard. And also as we move to the next slide, in ensuring environmental and social safeguards and sustainability. Now, I'll just talk briefly about this, but in addition to screening for gender aspects of your project, your applications must indicate which sustainable development goals the project will contribute to. And in addition, the Secretariat will review applications to flag any potential adverse impacts from a safeguards perspective. Now, to do this effectively, we rely on the UNEP Environmental and Social Sustainability Framework, which was revised and adopted in its revised form in February of 2020. So that framework follows these four guiding principles. First, leave no one behind. Second, human rights and gender equality and women's empowerment. Third, sustainability and resilience. And fourth, accountability. So as you can see on the screen, there are a number of specific elements that the framework addresses. And we will look at all of those as we review applications. And here again, it's really important to note that stakeholder engagement is an essential part of implementing safeguards. Also, monitoring and corrective action would be implemented during the life of the project to address any impacts that might arise. And also for projects that have a particularly useful approach from a safeguards perspective, we would seek to publicize that for the benefit of other implementers. Now with that, I'd like to turn over to Irene, who will look at the project application in much more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marian. As she just said, we will now look at how the project application can be elaborated using the application guidelines and the application forms. And I see that my colleagues have kindly added the links to the application guidelines, which are available in English, French, and Spanish. And you can find the link in the chat. I believe they will also add very shortly the link to the application forms. forms A, B, and C, which I will explain in more details now. So as I said, for your submission to be complete, you will have to submit 3 application forms. Form A on project application, Form B on project activity-based budget, and Form C on letter of transmittal. And we will look into those in more details now. So I will ask my colleague Shariful to kindly share the screen and project Form A. So this is the project application form that you can find on the website and now I believe in the chat. So let's look at it very quickly. It's kind of straightforward. So you will see that the first set of information you will have to provide is about the applicant government and the applicant government institution, including a name of an applicant government official. Then you will have to provide information, the project title, budget, the duration of the project, the status of your country, and the relevant convention articles, which are basically the articles of the Minamata Convention that your project will help to implement. And then there's a space for a project summary, and this will provide a high-level summary of the project to the Secretariat, and it will be used for our communication purposes. Then scrolling down, you will see that you will have to provide information on the rationale for your project. You will have to give information on the previous projects that your country has implemented related to the Minamata Convention. And those include the Minamata Initial Assessment, the MIA or the National Action Plan for ASGM, the NAP, and these are enabling activities funded by the JEF. But not only these JEF-funded projects, also other projects funded, for example, by the special program and the JEF. There will be space at the bottom of this form to provide all the information on other projects that you have implemented or are in the process of implementing. Then, as you can see, there's a request for information on expected results for your project and project management. This is kind of important, especially the other part that is called project partners, because it is important that you highlight here the key project partners that you are planning to engage in the implementation of your project. So the project will be implemented by the applicant because under the SIP there is no provision for an implementing agency. This is different, for example, from the JEF. But we know that some of our applicants, previous applicants and prospective applicants, hopefully, would like to work closely with, for example, other partners, including the Basel and Stockholm Conventions regional centers, but also other partners could be non-governmental research institutes, non-governmental organizations, or even UN agencies, local offices in the country. And these would all need to be listed as project partners in this application form. And as I said, but I will repeat it because it's important, the responsibility for implementing the project remains always with the applicant government entity. So moving, scrolling a bit down, you see that there's also a table that provides a summary on the budget and funding for your project, and this will be completed after you complete another form that is called Form B, and it's about budget, and we will look into that shortly. Then you will have to provide other project considerations like the expected impact, elaborate a bit more on the sustainability of your project in the long term, the national ownership, then going a bit down, further down, you will have to provide information on gender and how your project considers gender mainstreaming and has gender elements, as Marian explained earlier, and how your project incorporates the sustainable development goals. Then scrolling down, you will have to indicate in this section whether your applicant government plans to make a contribution to the project. Under the SIP, the applicant government contribution is not mandatory, but your government may decide to make a contribution in kind or money contribution, and you will have to indicate it here. Then, as I said, you will have to indicate if you have received or requested funding from the JEF or the special program. And you will have section 4.2, quite important, scrolling a bit down, because it's about monitor, reporting, evaluation, and audit. And it is very important to understand the different functions of these activities. So monitoring and reporting. Monitoring of the project implementation, of course, refers to the routine collection and analysis of information. And this will be needed to track the progress, to check the compliance, and to make informed decisions for project management at each level of the project implementation. And monitoring activities will need to be built into the project work plan and a logical framework, and you will need to allocate resources, both human and perhaps financial resources from the start for this activity. And the regular reporting is the responsibility of the project manager. And the forms for reporting will be provided by the Secretariat and included in the legal agreement for your project. And you will be requested to report back to the Secretariat normally twice a year in June and December. And now moving to the next, which is evaluation. This is different from monitoring and reporting, and there are two different scenarios. So the first scenario is about projects, SIP projects that will be approved and will have funding of 150,000 US dollars or less than that. In this case, the recipient government will be required to arrange for what we call the terminal review. And the terminal review is mandatory and falls under the responsibility of the government. It can be done internally or externally, and applicant governments will need to set aside funds for this purpose as part of the project budget or an in-kind government contribution. The amount budgeted for this terminal review may be around $2,000, but it should not exceed $4,000. And the Secretariat has prepared guidelines for conducting these terminal reviews that, of course, will be shared with you at the end of your project if you happen to be preparing a terminal review. Of course, all this information is included in the application guidelines, so you can always find it there. Then there's the second scenario. As I said, projects that will have funding from the SIP of 150,000 US dollars or more than that. And in this case, it will not be the terminal review that will be conducted at the end of the project, but what we call the terminal evaluation. It's again a mandatory requirement for the project, and the terminal evaluations will be initiated based on criteria identified by the UNEP Evaluation Office and the Secretariat of the Minamata Convention, so us, will manage the process for these terminal evaluations, which will be funded by this specific trust fund, so the SIP trust fund. And the evaluations will be done following the project closeout, so at the end of your project, and they will be conducted by independent evaluators. And the project focal points that you will identify for your projects will be expected to be available to support this process in the final months of project implementation and also following project closeout. Now, under this section, you can also see that we request you to provide 100 words on audit arrangements. All the information on audit is also available in the application guidelines, but I will just summarize a little bit what we mean by audit requirements and arrangements. So the applicant government is responsible for the financial management and also the audit of the project. And every year, annually, within 6 months of the end of its fiscal year, the applicant government will be requested to submit a copy of its consolidated audited financial statements to the Secretariat. And this will be issued by an independent audit authority and will need to clearly identify the SIP funding. An alternative to the consolidated audited financial statements will be for the applicant government to submit an annual audit of the project. And these annual audits can be budgeted as an activity of the project in the logical framework and in the budget. And additionally, the applicant government will be responsible for conducting a final audit of the project. And this will be again issued by an independent audit authority and submitted to the Secretariat following the completion of the project technical activities. And the final audit is normally submitted with the final reports, both narrative and expenditure reports that you will have to submit at the end of the project. And the total budget for the project audit arrangements, should not exceed $5,000. Now, we have looked at Form A on the project application. Let's now take a quick look at Form B, which is an Excel spreadsheet. And this is the form about the project activity-based budget. As you can see, it is composed of 4 different tabs. Now we are in tab 1 on budget summary. And as you can see here, you will have to provide information on the specific trust fund budget requested. This is the fund, the SIP budget that you request for your project in all years of implementation. Your project can have a duration of 3 years maximum, but it can also be shorter than that. And also in this same tab, you will have to provide information on the applicant government contribution, if applicable, because as I said earlier, it is not mandatory. In the second tab, this is the most important tab in your Form B. You will have to detail activity, output by output, and activity by activity, the budget that you plan to allocate to the implementation of each activity. And this will be done for each and every category that we identify in this table. So you see there are 4 categories: staff and other personnel, contractual services, equipment, and travel. And under those categories, you will have to assign budget for the implementation of the activities. And Marian will explain more about those categories later in this presentation. So the total will be displayed at the bottom of this table. In the third tab, you will provide details on the applicant government contribution, if applicable, and this will be divided by outputs. And in the fourth tab, you have the class explanation. So those categories that I was mentioning earlier are explained in more detail, so you know exactly what kind of elements are covered by each and every category. So now let's take a look at Form C. Shariful, please. This is the third and last form you will have to submit to the Secretariat by the deadline of 31st of July, and it's called Letter of Transmittal. Here you will have to provide 3 signatures, one of the applicant government official, the second one will be from the national focal point of the Minamata Convention, and the third from the JEF operational focal point. And Marian will also explain a bit more about this later. But yeah, very important takeaway from this part of the presentation, you will have to submit the 3 forms to the Secretariat by the deadline. So now let's move on to the logical framework. I've been mentioning this quite a few times already. So this is what we call the logical framework, or the log frame, and it describes the project components and explain the details of how the project will operate and how it will affect the change intended by your country. And in this slide, you can see what a logical framework looks like. It is contained in Form A in the project application, and it will serve as the roadmap for implementation of your project and as a tool for evaluating and monitoring progress in implementation. So once you have determined the impact and the outcome of your project, then you will have to elaborate on the various outputs and associated activities. Marian has already mentioned the outputs and activities earlier when she was speaking about the tier of change. But now let's look a bit more on how to do that. So there are As we mentioned, there are the outputs, and these are the tangible goods and services that the project produces or delivers. And in this example, in the slide, you can see that the output is the development of a national Mercury information system. And then you will have to ask yourself, how do you know if you are making progress in achieving this output? And for this reason, you will have to indicate the indicators and the means of verification. So the indicators are units of measurement that will help you assess the progress towards the achievement of the output. And it is very important to know and to note in the logical framework the baseline of the indicator. And this is what the situation is when the project starts, and the target, which is where you would like to be at the end of your project. As you can see here, the baseline is normally 0, and the target is another number that you can determine depending on your project. And then the means of verification are helpful to determine if the indicator and consequently the output has been achieved or not. So then you will have to determine the activities, and these are the actions to be completed in order to achieve the output. And as mentioned earlier, these are basically practical actions that could be like conducting a workshop or forming a steering committee or preparing a report, or as you can see in the slide, also technical, the formation of a technical working group, comparative study, etc. And in the last column on the right, you are also expected to insert the milestones, and this is the time by which you expect to complete the activity. And you will have to indicate both the month and the year of your project. In the next slide, we will look at the work plan. So once you have developed and completed the logical framework, the activities and the outputs that you have identified need to be reflected in the work plan. And this is also contained in Form A that you will have to submit by the deadline to the Secretariat. So all the outputs and activities are repeated here in the work plan, showing the time frame in which the work will be done. And this is by quarter, and you won't have to specify the actual months, but you will have to basically color the relevant quarter. And the months will be counted from the beginning of your project, because at the stage when you submit your project application, you will not know the start date of your project. And if the project is approved by the governing board, we will begin the process of revising the project documents, and this can take some time. So the months are indicated as anonymous in this project document. In the next slide, we will look at the project budget. As I mentioned earlier, this is Form B, the Excel spreadsheet. And what is super important to mention is that the SIP project budgets are results-based budgets, and they are therefore organized by activity, output and activity. So in a similar way, like you did for the work plan, each output and each activity in the work plan and logical framework has to be reflected in the budget table. And please also keep in mind that there's a small section in application form A, which I showed you earlier. They should be consistent with the project budget section, and that you will have to complete after you complete the Form B budget table. Moving on to the next slide. This is to give you a better view of the budget table as contained in the second tab of the Form B. And as mentioned, the project budget for SIP projects is a results-based budget, and the total will be shown in the grand total column. And you will have to indicate to allocate funding for each and every activity. And with that, I will turn back to Marian for the last part of the presentation.
Wonderful. So we're getting close to the end here. We'll have plenty of time for any questions you might have. But what we want to talk about for just a moment is the budget categories in a bit more depth, and specifically what can and cannot be funded by the SIP. So when developing your budget, it's important to understand the specific trust fund budget categories. They're divided into 4 broad categories, and these are staff and other personnel costs, contractual services, equipment, and travel. And so those 4 categories will be the 4 columns in your results-based budget. And please note that for specialized and technical equipment, there's a cap of 10% that was established by the governing board, but up to 25% of your total budget could be considered eligible for specialized and technical equipment if you provide a justification, and that justification would need to be included as an annex to your application. Now, the output on monitoring, review, evaluation, and audit has kind of a notional cap on it also. It should not exceed 15,000 US dollars. And please do include that output as the last output in your log frame, your work plan, and your results-based budget. So the last output would be monitoring, review, evaluation, and audit. Now, let's talk about what cannot be funded by the SIP trust fund. As you can see from this slide, the SIP cannot fund current or running institutional costs, and those can include the cost of renting office space, office equipment, furniture, vehicles, fuel, electricity, etc. Those are not eligible. Also not eligible are wages of civil servants, of government officials. Also not eligible are hospitality costs. For example, the costs in connection with receptions given to participants if you're having a SIP workshop or a conference, seminar. We cannot fund the hospitality costs. Of course, costs that are not directly related to the project would not be eligible for funding, and costs that are disproportionate to the overall budget also would not be eligible. So it's expected that costs of any of these types would be covered by the applicant if they're necessary. So one more thing, we don't have operating expenses in our budgets. So there are certain things like bank fees that cannot be covered, cannot be requested in your budget because we don't have an operating expenses budget category. And also currency fluctuation costs, those would be borne by the applicant government and cannot be charged to the SIP budget. So now, I hope that gives you enough information on the budget items that can and cannot be funded through the project. So let's move on to the letter of transmittal. Now, the final form is Form C, and Irene already described that in some detail to you, but we want to really emphasize that this document needs to be signed by 3 entities. The first is the applicant government official, and this should be the person whose contact details are provided in Section 1 of your project application Form A. And then the second signature is from the Minamata Convention National Focal Point, who I said earlier needs to be fully engaged in this project. And the third is from the JEF operational focal point in your country or your constituency. So sometimes we've seen that getting these signatures takes quite a bit of time. So please be sure to allocate sufficient time to obtain the signatures. and make sure that that's well prior to the application deadline, because we need that form in order to consider your application to be complete on the 31st of July or earlier. So, and in fact, all these officials really should be part of the planning process before the application is even written. When you're designing your project, when you're figuring out what makes sense for your application, you should really include all these entities. So you're requested to email the signed form in PDF format to us at the Secretariat for the application to be considered complete. And you're requested to not modify the Form C. Modified forms will not be accepted. And finally, moving on to finalizing your project application. Now, once you've completed Forms A, B, and C, we recommend that you take some time on this completeness checklist. That's in section 2.1 of Form A. And please make sure that the contact details are correct also, since those will be our official means of communication with you on the outcome of the governing board's decision-making on your project application. Also, please do include the information on related projects. This information is really important because it shows how the project has perhaps built on other projects for which you've received funding, or other bilateral or other projects you've engaged in. And if it's being executed in a sort of a complementary or synergistic way with ongoing or completed projects. So please do pay particular attention to that related projects section. Now, how to send in the forms. Please note that you're requested to send in Form A in PDF and in Word format, Form B in Excel, and Form C in PDF, and also, if possible, in Word format. Normally, the signatures would come to us in PDF, but you can send the unsigned version in Word so that we have better access to your contact details. Please do not mail anything to us. All this should be submitted electronically to the Secretariat's mailbox. So the Secretariat mailbox is at MEA-Minamata Secretariat @un.org. You can also contact any of us who have been working with you here today on this webinar in the run-up with questions or when you're submitting your application process. Now, very importantly, we at the Secretariat will send you an email acknowledging receipt of your application. If for any reason you do not receive such an acknowledgement, such a response from us within a week of your submitting the application, please reach out to us. Please let us know, because sometimes things do end up lost in cyberspace or in a junk folder for no explicable reason. Things happen like that. We want to make sure we have received your application. And so please look closely for that acknowledgement email. Please contact us if you don't receive it. So with that, right at 4 o'clock on the nose Geneva time, we are finished with our presentation, and we're happy to open the floor for any questions or comments, discussion points you might have. And again, you can also put your questions or comments into the chat box. I'll give you a few minutes. And please do note that that email address that I read off to you is also in the chat. Thank you, John Yue. And please copy that down. It's also, of course, in the application guidelines. We think that everything is pretty clear in the application guidelines, but we're happy for your feedback in that regard. And of course, you can access this presentation as well as the recording of this session from our website and from our YouTube channel. It might take a little bit of time, but no later than 48 hours from now. I guess we've been quite clear. Do we have any hands raised? Let's see.
No hands so far.
No hands. Okay, hopefully that means we've been clear and we haven't rushed through all this information. But I will give this just a few more minutes in case of any questions you'd like to put in the chat or in case of any raised hands. Okay, Irene, anything else we mentioned too quickly or forgot to mention? I think we've covered everything.
I think, yes, we have covered everything. And in case of any questions, as Marian said, you can always reach out to us.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for your time and attention. I think it means that you're interested in full implementation of the Minamata Convention, which is what we at the Secretariat are also interested in every day. So we're very happy for your interest. We hope to see a lot of great applications, and we look forward to a really interesting and exciting governing board meeting when these applications are considered. So please keep in touch with us, and thank you for all your work. Bye-bye, everyone.